Good evening, everyone. Especially you guys up top. Hello up there. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Purcell. I'm the Associate Director for Catholic Social Tradition here at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. I was one of the conveners for this conference here, and we're very excited that all of you are here. These are definitely exciting and blessed days, much things happening in the church, as we know. And so with hope, let us pray. Loving Creator, you give this time to be together, to reflect, to analyze, to think about action. Together, let us be people of peace, people that follow St. Francis's message, to be instruments of peace, that together we may work for peace and justice on the shoulders of past saints, on many lay leaders in the church over the years, and as we gather together to build future lay leaders, that we may truly build a world where we can lift up human dignity and solidarity and live out the option for the poor. And that we really may turn to listen to each other and act together to build the common good and community each and every day with our mind and our heart and our soul. We ask this through your blessing. Amen. And again, this is a biennial conference of the Center for Social Concern, and this year's we celebrate excitedly the golden anniversary of John 23rd's platform for Catholic social action. In paragraph 163, it says, "We are called to establish with truth, justice, charity, and liberty new methods of relationships in human society." May we continue, starting today, to build those relationships, and especially in new ways. And may this conference that we're here to be together add to the growth of the Catholic social tradition as we look what we have done for peace and justice, what we are doing now, and how we can continue to develop a vision for the future. And I think how appropriate it is at this time to have this conference as we celebrate in our church our new Pope Francis, who's called us to be people who put the poor people first and to become peace builders in a world filled with violence, that we may truly practice washing each other's feet. Let these days together, let us think about how we continue to learn, discern, and act more effectively for peace and justice. And right now I want to especially recognize our keynote speakers who've really traveled many miles to join us to talk about how we work on peace on earth. We have Amina Rasul from the Philippines. Amina, want to stand up for a second? Amina. She's enjoying that beautiful south end weather here, along with Father James Shannon, who's here from Lahore, Pakistan. Julian Filikowski, who's here from Great Britain. And Kathy Kelly's in Chicago, but she just got back from Afghanistan. So, Kathy. And this event would not happen without supportive leadership. And please let me join me in recognizing the Executive Director of the Center for Social Concerns, Father Paul Coleman, and thanking him for this conference today. And also, before I introduce tonight's keynote, I want to thank our co-sponsors. This wouldn't happen, and that's why we do this, for one, do it biannually, but also what it needs to put this together in order to keep costs low, in order to make it to participate as wide as possible. And so we have a number of co-sponsors, especially I want to recognize the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, Catholic Relief Services, and the National Center for the Laity, and a host of Notre Dame co-sponsors that have helped us to develop, which is the minor for Catholic Social Tradition, the minor in Poverty Studies, interdisciplinary minor, the Center for Civil and Human Rights, the Center for the Study of Religion and Society, the College of Arts and Letters Henkel's Lecture Series, the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, Departments of Political Science and of Theology, the Institute for Church Life, the Institute for Latino Studies, both the Kellogg and the Kroc Institutes, and the Office of Sustainability. We need to thank them all for their generous support of letting us engage our minds, hearts, and souls. And then with pleasure, I get to introduce our keynote speaker, Father Kenneth Himes. I actually had the blessing, he's probably sick of hearing about his brother Michael. I actually lived down the hall from his brother Michael for a number of years at Moreau. But when I thought of organizing originally to do a Catholic Social Tradition conference, we did this 2 years ago to do Dear Brothers and Sisters, celebrating 120 years since Rerum Novarum. There's one person I thought of that I wanted to have at that conference, and the first person I called was Ken Himes. And I said, will you come so that I can actually have a solid foundation and really build on the reputation of Catholic Social Tradition? So I was stealing from Boston College from a Franciscan to help us here at Notre Dame. And he's somebody I really wanted. And due to a number of unforeseen circumstances, then he helped me. We ended up getting Brian Massengale to replace him. But first, I wasn't going to wait him out, so I figured I had a 4-year wait on him. But we got him to come. So I was made sure we had him come from Boston College this year. And I've actually have a number of years been privileged, probably since about '92, to listen to Father Ken speak inspirationally about what Catholic social tradition is, what is Catholic social thought. He's a creative thinker, but also he's a compassionate pastor who lives his Franciscan charism. Ken received his PhD from Duke in religion and public policy. He's the past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He is a prolific writer. He's written many articles, probably read many of them in places like America and Commonweal. I know he's written over 75 essays, and he has 5 different books that he's put out. He's definitely a man of peace and a man of justice who I think tonight will really set the tone for the next couple days for this conference. In his talk, PACEM and TERRIS, its context and legacy. So please help me welcome a true inspiration, Father Kenneth Himes.
Well, good evening. That was a little over the top as an introduction, but I'll try to live up to a small portion of it anyway in my remarks. October of 1962. Much of the world is focused on a confrontation between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The 13-day standoff was among the most tense incidents in the more than 4 decades-long Cold War between the Americans and the Soviets. It was also a moment when the threat of nuclear war seemed most real to a young boy in Brooklyn, New York, who, along with 8th grade classmates, practiced drills of hiding under our school desks in the event of nuclear attack. Even then, it was not clear to me what protection our desks would provide, given that I sat near a wall of windows, each of them about 8 feet high. I was unconvinced that my desk would save me from dying from broken glass, not to mention nuclear radiation or a nuclear fireball. But I did take some consolation when my teacher explained that the communists would almost certainly aim their missiles at Manhattan rather than my Brooklyn neighborhood. Not for the first time, the East River provided a sense of safety from whatever evil might befall Manhattanites. 6 months later, April 11th, 1963, John the 23rd issued an encyclical. That was a new word for me, entitled PACEM, TERRIS, Peace on Earth. Although we were told then that the Pope wanted to respond to what had come to be called the Cuban Missile Crisis, the papal letter was more accurately described by an Italian journalist as, quote, the utopia of John the 23rd. That is, it was an encyclical less concerned with commentary on current events and more of an effort to explain the papal viewpoint on what peace might mean in the modern age and how it might come about. In my remarks this evening, I am not going to rehearse the content of John's letter. Instead, I wish to do three things. First, I'd like to begin with a brief word about the tone and impact of the document. Second, I want to highlight several important themes: human rights, the global common good, and the nature of peace, that are raised by the encyclical, and that illustrate the legacy of those topics for the work of his papal successors. And third, I want to suggest briefly a future agenda for moving the legacy of PACEM, TERRIS forward. So, let's begin with a brief word about the tone and impact of the document. The first thing a reader of PACEM, TERRIS might have noticed is that it is addressed to all people of goodwill. The usual audience for papal encyclicals was all the Catholic bishops. Encyclicals are simply circular letters sent to the worldwide episcopate. And the text of papal social teaching prior to PACEM, TERRIS were addressed to that audience. Beginning with John's letter, and ever since, papal social encyclicals are now addressed to all people, Catholic or not, religious believer or unbeliever. This universal audience is appropriate not only because of the topic of the letter, the universal concern for peace, but because the intended audience also reflects the papal conviction that what is being taught is rooted in natural law, a philosophical method that claims not to be reliant upon the specific revelation of Christian faith, but teaching that is rooted in the exercise of right reason, examining human experience. This natural law approach, with its outlook that human reason can apprehend truths acceptable to all people, has been a staple of Catholic social teaching. One of the most commonly cited convictions throughout the tradition is that the purpose of the state is to secure and promote the common good of society. By definition, this means that Catholic social teaching claims there is something that is shared by all, even in the most pluralistic communities. John and other popes believe all people of goodwill can reach a shared sense of what is good for society, and that Christians have a duty to work with other people in order to secure those goods. There is then both an epistemological and a moral optimism in the Catholic tradition, and nowhere are those qualities more evident than in PACEM, TERRIS. For John, the natural law found within the heart of each human person guides a moral order that includes the relations between individuals with one another between individuals and the state, between states with other states, and relations within the global community. The norms governing these relationships can be known, according to John, and the resulting social order can be attained if people only demonstrate the requisite goodwill. It is rather remarkable that the Pope could issue such a positive vision and maintain such a hopeful stance toward the achievement of peace just a few months after the world had been at the doorstep of nuclear war. But good Pope John was nothing if not optimistic about the possibilities of human transformation. Like any utopian vision, the encyclical was open to criticism from those who held a more skeptical view of the possibilities of a peaceful world order, or at least skeptical about the relative ease with which John envisioned it coming about. Reinhold Niebuhr, the influential proponent of Christian realism in theological ethics, thought that John's hope in an institution like the United Nations as an instrument of world order was simply misguided. And even the prominent Jesuit John Courtney Murray said in his usually understated way that it was, quote, unclear how this hope is concretely to be realized. PACEM and TERRIS was well received by many in the peace movement. And John's letter did encourage a generation of Catholic activists who became involved in the anti-war movement during the decades of the 60s and 70s. The impact of the letter led, I believe, to the willingness of the bishops at Vatican II to reconsider the Church's teaching on nonviolence. John did not explicitly deny the theory of just war, but his silence in the encyclical about the right of national self-defense, coupled with his clear opposition to nuclear war, created a mood of questioning on the topic of modern warfare. It was that context which found expression in the statement of the Council at Vatican II that we need, quote, an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude. Exactly what that new attitude was left unstated, but it is plausible to understand it as the establishment of a moral presumption against war. Starting with John and continuing through the papacies of Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, a teaching has developed that a presumption against war lies at the very center of Catholic thinking on war and peace. Whereas most earlier theories of just war gave the presumption to justice, and war was understood as being morally acceptable as a means to attain such justice. However, today, the present formulation of the Church's teaching, with a presumption against war as a means to justice, reflects this new attitude called for at Vatican II. An important corollary of this attitude of a presumption against war was the approval given to pacifism as an alternative to just war theory. In his 1956 Christmas radio message, Pius XII had written that when legitimate political authority, and I quote, in a moment of extreme danger, decides that a war of self-defense is necessary, a Catholic citizen cannot invoke his own conscience in order to refuse to serve and fulfill those duties the law imposes, unquote. Just 9 years later, in 1965, the bishops at Vatican II declared, quote, "We cannot fail to praise those who renounce the use of violence in the vindication of their rights. And it seems right that laws make humane provisions for the case of those who, for reasons of conscience, refuse to bear arms, provided that they accept some other form of service to the human community," unquote. That clear reversal of previous teaching developed in the span of less than a decade. I know a decade may seem like a long time if you're an undergraduate at University of Notre Dame. It seems like half your life. But in the life of the church, it's a nanosecond. The influence of PACEM and TERRIS as a sort of final testament of John the 23rd had helped shift the way that Catholics thought about war. Such was the impact of PACEM and TERRIS. In this next and longest section of my paper, I'd like to highlight three important themes of the document. Those themes, again, are human rights, the global common good, and the meaning of peace. Human rights. One astute commentator on the encyclical has observed that while the topic of PACEM and TERRIS is peace, the backbone of the document is its teaching on human rights. That is, the encyclical offers a distinctively Catholic approach to peacemaking, one that focuses on the realization of human rights as the substance of a peaceful world order. In paragraphs 8 through 27 of PACEM and TERRIS, John provides the most comprehensive list of those rights that the Church endorses in the modern era. John the 23rd had been the Vatican nuncio in Paris during the period when the UN Declaration on Human Rights was being shaped. Any number of studies written about that period have noted that Angelo Roncalli, as he was then known, was quietly encouraging work on the Declaration, even as his boss, Pius XII, was expressing reservations about the lack of theoretical foundations being given for the UN statement. For those who knew that background of Roncalli, it was not a surprise that as John the 23rd, he provided a list of rights in PACEM and TERRIS that closely mirrors those enumerated in the UN Declaration. The reason John, and the Catholic social tradition in general, accepted an inclusive approach to human rights is that such rights are understood to be expressions of those conditions necessary for human beings to experience their dignity. Unlike the Western liberal approach that sees personal liberty as the basis of rights, or the socialist tradition that considers equality as the foundation of rights, Catholic teaching adopts human dignity as the origin of rights discourse. Each person requires a set of goods, freedoms, and relationships in order to flourish and attain full development. Seeing the dignity of the person as the source for human rights allowed the Church to embrace a more comprehensive roster of rights that challenged both liberal and socialist ideologies. Years later, the papacy of John Paul II was an era not only of increased appeal to human rights in Catholic teaching, but significantly increased the dramatic papal actions on the behalf of human rights. Through his extensive travels, John Paul II knew the pluralism of social models firsthand. The daunting diversity of political, economic, social, and cultural institutions throughout our world was undeniable. Yet, John Paul was not the least bit hesitant in acting upon his role as universal pastor within the church. The challenge for John Paul, however, was how to formulate teaching in a manner that permitted him to speak to very disparate situations. Poland, the Philippines, Uganda, Brazil, the United States. And the primary way that he hit upon became the discourse of human rights. John Paul used his teaching on human rights as a vehicle to assess positively and negatively the many different nations that he visited in his papal trips. There might be significant differences between a gathering in Chicago or one in Manila, but in both settings, the Pope could appeal to basic human rights to affirm or to challenge his listeners. In effect, the human rights teaching of the papacy developed as an ethical framework that set limits while permitting pluralism in a way that societies might organize themselves. Human rights could be understood as establishing a picture frame surrounding a canvas. Every society has the freedom to paint upon the canvas in a way that is most suitable to it, given the history, culture, values, resources, and beliefs of that society. In fashioning a political or economic system, there is no single right way to do it, any more than there is only one right way to paint a picture. However, whatever economic and political institutions and arrangements are fashioned, they cannot violate human rights. The painting cannot extend beyond the canvas and ignore the picture frame. There is legitimate pluralism within limits. And for matters of social life, those limits are set by the framework of human rights. In the wake of 20th century horrors, such as World War II, the Shoah, the Gulag, and totalitarian regimes, the Pope saw that the key for genuine politics was to establish it upon the firm foundation of an authentic humanism. For John Paul, the agenda was how to explicate how Christian humanism might shape a better politics. In such an approach, human rights plays a large part, for they specify the social conditions that make human dignity possible. In 1979, at the United Nations, John Paul presented his own list of human rights that the Church acknowledged and referred to these as a humanistic criterion for assessing all social systems. Speaking before the United Nations, he put it directly, quote, "It is a question of the highest importance that in internal social life, as well as in international life, all human beings in every nation and country should be able to enjoy effectively their full rights under any political regime or system," unquote. As the distinguished political scientist Samuel Huntington has observed, Roman Catholicism since Vatican II has become one of the dominant forces for advancing democracy and human rights in the world. Such, I suggest, is the legacy of PACEM and TERRIS. My second point, the universal common good. A major development in John's letter is his employment of the idea of a universal or global common good. Aware of the phenomenon of interdependence, John the 23rd realized that limiting the common good to domestic society of the nation was no longer adequate. After all, as he wrote, the social progress, order, security, and peace of each country are necessarily connected with the social progress, order, security, and peace of all other countries, unquote. The growing transnational network that connects the fate of one nation with another led the Pope to a simple conclusion. Quote, "Given these conditions, it is obvious that individual countries cannot rightly seek their own interests and develop them themselves in isolation from the rest." The difficulty, however, was that even if national leaders were aware of the interdependent nature of international life, the existing policies, structure, and architecture of the international community were unable to adequately address the challenges. The purpose of political authority is to protect and promote the common good. Existing state authorities usually have the resources and powers that allow them to fulfill that duty linked to the domestic or national common good. However, the same does not appear to be true with the universal or global common good. As John said in PACEM and TERRIS, today the universal common good poses problems of worldwide dimensions, which cannot be adequately tackled or solved except by the efforts of public authority endowed with a wideness of powers, structures, and means of the same proportion. That is, of public authority which is in a position to operate in an effective manner on a worldwide basis. The moral order itself, therefore, demands that such a form of public authority be established, unquote. The key to that papal reasoning is the last line. The moral order requires creation of a new kind of political authority. John's reasoning is quite traditional and very direct. The purpose of all public authority is to protect and promote the common good entrusted to its jurisdiction. Ordinarily, a town, a city, a county, a state, a nation has the requisite power and ability to be reasonably effective in discharging its duty toward the common good within its jurisdiction. If it were chronically incapable in discharging its duty, then a new structure of governance would necessarily be brought in to replace the failing institution. So if a state government cannot address issues of physical security, the federal government steps into the void. This is precisely the reasoning of Hamilton in the Federalist Papers in his argument for why we needed a strong central government. When the structure of the nation state is no longer able to satisfy the duty of protecting and promoting the universal common good, a new structure is necessary, according to John. The critical flaw in international politics is that there is no competent structure to do for the global common good what the national government does for the domestic common good. When John introduced the idea of a global common good in PACEM and TERRIS, he was translating the traditional language from its local and national contexts to a new setting. He noted the existence of global problems that transcended the ability of any one nation to remedy them, and the lack of any adequate transnational authority to address the problems. The Pope did not call for a world state, but rather for creative means whereby existing public authorities might address global concerns in a fair and non-coercive manner. John did not develop a fully adequate analysis of the global common good, but his insight prodded social theorists to consider those shared goods and shared bads that might be addressed at a transnational level. His language pointed out a necessary way of thinking as interdependence became a greater and more real reality in the latter half of the 20th century. Catholic social thought sees globalization as a set of practices and institutions that can and should be made subject to oversight by moral agents. In order for that to happen, however, there must be mechanisms for governance and regulation that take into account the emerging architecture of international relations. The old building blocks of nation states have not disappeared, but they now operate within a very different context. States retain power, yet they must wield that power in collaboration with other states and with non-state actors. Globalization has taken some oversight power away from nations and placed other economic actors in a more depoliticized global space. Just as with any social space, however, there is a need for regulation, a need to codify rights and responsibilities. However, reasonable regulation is not an enemy of globalization, but a necessity if there is to be avoidance of a backlash against the abuses of an unregulated free market capitalism. As Aquinas and other earlier Christian thinkers knew, wherever there is a society, there needs to be governance. Attention to the multiple levels of global society and the diversity of actors to be engaged in the life of that global society suggests the need for greater interest in what Catholic social thought calls subsidiarity. This traditional theme calls for keeping the capacities to assess, decide, and act at the most local level possible while still being effective in securing the common good. What is needed is a new framework within which forms of global authority may be conceived. This age of globalization requires the creation of institutions and practices for managing an emerging world order. The challenge is to find an approach so that globalization may be regulated and directed without creating a massive bureaucratic world state. In his 2003 World Day of Peace message, John Paul II wrote, quote, "Is this not the time for all to work together for a new constitutional organization of the human family, truly capable of ensuring peace and harmony between peoples, as well as their integral development? But let there be no misunderstanding. This does not mean writing the constitution of a global superstate. Rather, it means continuing and deepening processes already in place to meet the almost universal demand for participatory ways of exercising political authority, even international political authority." Unquote. John Paul returned to the theme in another speech later that same year. After listing several negative aspects of the present state of globalization, he called for guidelines that, quote, "will place globalization firmly at the service of authentic human development in full respect of the rights and dignity of all," unquote. He then continued to say that he did not see globalization itself as the problem. Quote, "Rather, difficulties arise from the lack of effective mechanisms for giving it proper direction. Globalization needs to be inserted into the larger context of a political and economic program that seeks authentic progress for all," unquote. Benedict XVI has also observed that due to the unrelenting growth of global interdependence, there is a strongly felt need, even in the midst of a global recession, for a reform of the United Nations and likewise of the economic institutions of international finance. Benedict went on to note, quote, to manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by the present crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and the greater imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security, and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment and to regulate migration. For all this, there is urgent need of a true political authority, unquote. The papal call for a new approach to global governance has, of course, been repeated by others. For it is widely acknowledged change in our social and economic realities has far outpaced change in the political institutions we have to govern them. It is important to remember, however, that these calls for new forms of governance and political authority are not equivalent to support for one world government. Several examples of new methods of regulation and agency should reflect globalization from below. These include citizens' organizations and transnational networks combating climate change, promoting human rights, or supporting microfinancing. Grassroots activism has forged links through globalized communications and travel on behalf of human rights, public health services, and fair trade. While subsidiarity is needed, a renewed approach to that principle should not simply refer to vertical levels of authority interacting with each other, but horizontal interaction among an array of organizations at the grassroots levels. What has been called globalization's democratic deficit must be countered by ensuring that existing institutions are reformed and new ones designed with participation, transparency, and accountability at the forefront. Organizations like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund need to go through a radical change that would ensure the equal participation of both the rich and poor nations of the world. What is needed is global governance that provides the poor with access to power and a voice in the regulation of globalization. Questions such as who rules, in whose name, by what means, and for what goals are vital for the future of governance. It is clear that there are multiple stakeholders in globalization's governance, and each should be able to find some means of having input. The Church will provide a genuine service if it can contribute to the formulation of an ethical framework that includes the legitimacy and usefulness of new models of subsidiarity, such as global policy regimes and global policy networks, just as past incarnations of subsidiarity contributed to our understanding about the nature, purpose, and role of the state. Such is the challenge of PACEM and TERRIS to our present global situation. My third topic, peace. Evident throughout John's encyclical is the belief that peace is more than the absence of war. Peace is not what remains after the shooting stops. Rather, peace is a positive concept, something that requires constructive action toward building and maintaining a certain type of social order. Key to understanding that social order is the notion of justice. That is why a significant development in the contemporary treatment of peace in Catholic practice is the evolution in the idea of justice. When the bishops at Vatican II proclaimed that peace is rightly and appropriately called an enterprise of justice, quoting Isaiah chapter 32, it was with a particular view of justice in mind. It was biblical justice. The biblical idea is rooted, as is so much of Hebrew thought, in the experience of covenant. The fundamental reality for the pious Jew was that Yahweh had freely entered into a relationship with the Jewish people that was marked by God's faithful and devoted love, Hesed. In those times when that fidelity and devotion was reciprocated by the Israelites, the experience of covenant was that the Jewish people lived in a set of right relationships with God, with one another, with all creation. Justice was the term used to characterize this state of being in right relationship. Biblical justice is of a different nature than the way most Americans think about justice. Unlike the American idea of justice as impartial or justice being blind, the biblical concept of justice portrays Yahweh as deeply partial, with a clear bias in favor of the Jewish people in general and toward the poor and marginal in particular. This explains the prophets' regular citation throughout the Old Testament concerning the treatment of the widow, the orphan, and the alien as a test of genuine community. This biblical triad of widow, orphan, and alien represent those people most at risk in a patriarchal and tribal society. In such a society, women and children without a spouse or father and aliens without kinship relations were understood as people on the margins of the community. So the test of a community's justice is whether those who might be easily neglected are instead brought into right relationship with others. In modern Catholic social teaching, this biblical perspective informs the way that the Church understands social justice. Community is at the heart of the vision of justice in Catholic thought. The goal is to establish communities where people are able to live in right relationship with one another, as well as with God and the rest of creation. Creating communal institutions and policies that reach out to and protect the marginal in modern societies remains the key test for justice. When Catholic social teaching discusses a preferential option for the poor, it is simply trying to retrieve the biblical idea of a special love and concern for those who represent the contemporary version of widows, orphans, and aliens in our societies. When the bishops at Vatican II declared, peace results from that harmony built into human society by its divine founder and actualized by persons as they thirst after ever greater justice, the bishops were presuming an appreciation of this wider Christian understanding of what justice means. One sees in the Vatican text not only the communitarian perspective of justice found in the Bible, but also the Augustinian theme of peace as an order of tranquility that comes from harmonious relationships. It is with those comments in mind that one can properly interpret Paul VI's now famous statement in Progressio Populorum that development is the new name for peace. When Paul surveyed the state of the globe in the late 60s, he concluded that the great social question of the age was the growing gap between rich and poor, both within states and between them. The gap is economic, but also political, as many experience a degree of powerlessness that prevents them from bringing about change that would be beneficial. For Paul VI, the needed remedy was to assist the poor to undergo integral development, an approach that was not limited to economics, but would include all dimensions of human well-being. An important aspect of a holistic view of development is that the poor and marginal must be active agents of their own advancement. What is needed is not a paternalistic charity program that maintains the poor as passive objects of concern, but rather empowerment that enables them to participate in their own self-development. Justice as participation has become an important emphasis of Catholic social thought. It suggests both the goal of justice as full participation in the life of a community, and also the means to that goal, the empowerment of the poor as active agents. So development, as the new name for peace, must be understood as a certain kind of process, one that is both just and participatory. An additional item that can be added to this evolving understanding of peace as just and participatory development came nearly 25 years after John wrote his encyclical. In 1987, John Paul II, reflecting on the teaching of John the 23rd and Paul VI, issued a follow-up encyclical on development, stating that, quote, solidarity is the path to peace and at the same time to development, unquote. Solidarity provides an energy that fosters a desire to work for true justice and true participation. From the work of solidarity in pursuit of this kind of development, there will emerge authentic peace. The goal of peace so desired by everyone will certainly be achieved through the putting into effect of social and international justice, but also through the practice of virtue which favors togetherness and which teaches us how to live in unity. That's paragraph 39 of Sollicitudo Rei Socialis. To summarize these comments on the evolution of Catholic teaching on peace, it is the outcome of a committed engagement, solidarity, an engagement to the project of social progress for individuals and societies, just and participatory development. The modern papacy has promoted this understanding by linking development as the new term for peace with solidarity as the crucial step in working for just development. Solidarity is the path to development, and peace is the end result of working for a development that is integral, just, and participatory. Such is the ongoing evolution of the tradition to which PACEM and TERRIS contributed. My final brief comment concerns the future and an important item on the agenda for those who wish to carry on the work of PACEM and TERRIS. It is with the background described above that one can see why the Catholic tradition has become more and more interested in what we now call peace building. The just war tradition has focused on war avoidance or war limitation, and the pacifist tradition on opposition to war. Peace building takes a different tact and focuses attentions on the conditions for creating peace. It presumes, in agreement with the Catholic tradition, that peace is something positive, not simply the absence of violence, but something that can be constructed. Therefore, strategies to establish peace and advance its maturation can and ought to be devised. The multiple levels of development demand that peace building be understood broadly. Indeed, while some in the policy community identify several distinct tasks, the Catholic tradition stresses the way that the different tasks are really related modes of working for peace, and not separate stages hermetically sealed off one from the other. First, there is the realm of what can be called prevention. That is, identifying situations that might produce conflict and then, through diplomacy, remove the sources of violence before they erupt. A second concern entails peacemaking, efforts to resolve issues that have already led to conflict. Yet another task is peacekeeping, working to preserve fragile ceasefires or interim solutions in order to create the space for implementing agreed-upon measures for a lasting change in tense relationships. And finally, there is building peace by means of renewing institutions and infrastructure destroyed by violence, encouraging actions of mutual benefit among previously opposed groups, and addressing the larger cause of conflict found in economic, social, and political injustice. Even as the emphasis on the proactive strategies for peace building grows, there is a willingness to consider the just war tradition may also continue to evolve. In particular, there has been a recognition that armed force may be necessary to remove certain obstacles to peace, yet military force can never be the sole means of securing authentic peace. The clearest illustration of the support for just war thinking within the Church's present teaching is the support expressed for what is called the responsibility to protect, or humanitarian intervention. The utility of military force to repel naked aggression against innocents, or to rid the world of oppressive regimes engaged in violations of human dignity such as genocide, continues to find recognition within Catholic social teaching. But the other aspect of the just war tradition is the convergence between peace building and what has come to be called the jus post bellum category of just war. Traditionally, just war theory has been divided into two categories of concern. The jus ad bellum, justice in going to war, addressed the question of when and where it was appropriate to take up arms and under what conditions. The jus in bello, justice in war, took up questions of how to fight war, what strategies and tactics are morally defensible, and what did not count as fighting fairly. During the past 15 years or so, a new set of concerns has arisen among just war theorists. How to end a war, and what moral duties are incumbent upon combatants after a war is over. This last set of concerns falls under the heading the jus post bellum, justice after war. Some interpretations of the rights and duties after war only address a narrow range of issues, like war crimes or war reparations. But a more expansive view of the obligation takes up issues of rebuilding and restoring infrastructure that is not only physical, for example, bridges or power grids, but also political and social, such as forms of government, legal systems, educational institutions. The presumption is that any attempt to return to the status quo prior to the war is neither possible, war is too destructive, but it is also not wise. After all, the status quo is what led to the conflict at the outset. Instead, what is needed is an effort to create a better situation than what existed prior to the conflict. This is especially the case in humanitarian intervention, where the avowed motive for taking up arms was not to punish an aggressor, but to assist an oppressed people in attaining a more humane life. Seen in this way, developments in the just war tradition would appear to be moving in the same direction as the interest in peace building, with its aim of bringing about social transformation for the sake of avoiding future conflict or restoring societies after conflict. However, thorny questions also come along with these developments. What social changes and what level of assistance are moral duties for victors in war? In cases of civil war or intrastate conflict, can the pursuit of justice in the face of war crimes exacerbate post-conflict tensions to the point that peace building becomes less likely rather than more? What are the duties of an occupying force? What degree of ongoing intervention in the internal life of a nation is justified by peace building? Can outsiders demand political change that is not endorsed by large segments of the population? These questions suggest that as helpful as the category jus post bellum may be, it also creates a new set of issues about which thoughtful and fair-minded people will disagree. For the words you've been waiting for. In conclusion, for a tradition to be a living tradition, it must have a growing end. While rooted in the past, it must engage the circumstances of the present. A living tradition permits not only the wisdom of the past to inform our response to the present, but for the present to elicit future developments in the tradition itself as it encounters new settings and new questions. Clearly, an evolutionary process has been underway in Catholic thinking about peace that has led to seeing connections with the promotion of human rights, with contributing to the global common good, with building upon the ancient wisdom of the scriptures and patristic writers. Justice, characterized by participation and solidarity, is what helps to bring about authentic development, and development is now the new name for peace. A renewed appreciation for pacifism and nonviolence as strategies for advancing genuine peace is also notable. Even within the just war tradition, the establishment of a presumption against war as part of Catholic teaching is an additional indication of ongoing change. Finally, the new concern for peace building, which harkens back to the traditional claim that peace is positive and not simply the absence of war, gives additional evidence that Catholic teaching continues to evolve since PACEM and TERRIS in 1963. Informed by these and other insights, dedicated disciples and faithful citizens can join in the spirit of good Pope John to address the difficult challenges that stand before us. By doing so, we will take seriously the words of our Lord. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Thank you.
So we're going to open up. There's two microphones at either end. If folks have questions, we'll open up for a few questions for Ken. If folks, before they ask Ken if they can please use the microphone so that way it can be recorded and so folks can hear.
Have I lulled you into apathy?
I'm a Holy Cross priest, Father Bob Nagosic. I recall that when John Paul II brought up the notion of solidarity, he was also talking about a conversion to solidarity. And as I remember, it seems to have been that the great obstacle for Catholics themselves to be really interested in Catholic social teaching was the lack of that conversion. It seems to me that this is what the church is about, conversion. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, there's little doubt that there's a kind of twofold challenge here, right? On the one hand, we've beaten this quote to death, right? Catholic social thought, the best kept secret. I mean, we've used that to the point where it's no longer the best kept secret. At least that line isn't, anyway. That would suggest that the real problem was ignorance, right? But I mean, ignorance is a problem. I'm not going to come out in favor of ignorance, but knowledge doesn't solve everything, all right? There's also the question of it's not just enlightening the mind, it's also about moving the will. Since I'm here at Notre Dame, I have to drop at least one football metaphor. So, if Coach Kelly goes in at halftime and Notre Dame is losing 14-0, I suspect he doesn't walk in and say, gentlemen, I happened to notice on the scoreboard as we were walking into locker room that the score was 14-0. They had 2 touchdowns and we have none. It seems to me that if that trend should continue in the second half, we would lose 4 touchdowns to none, 28-0. I suspect he says something a little different than that, right? The issue is not, do you know the score? Instead, he tells them that their mothers and fathers are home watching on national TV and they're crying right now, He perhaps tells them that half of them will lose their football scholarships if they don't perform better. He talks to them about all those poor sick children in hospitals around the world who are just praying for Notre Dame to win, right? In other words, he tries to reach these people at a different level than just give them facts. The task is visceral. He wants to arouse passion. He wants people to act with a certain motivation and passion. And I suspect when it comes to that, that's where social activists sometimes drop the ball, frankly. It's one of the reasons why, one of the worst divides we have at the grassroots level in the Catholic Church is between the Social Action Committee and the Liturgy Committee. Right? Because if you're going to move people, you need spirituality. If you're going to move people, you need liturgy. If you're going to bring about conversion, it's not going to happen simply by having someone quote encyclicals to one another, right? The encyclicals can give us some ideas, some content, but you need to hit people at the level of where they live and where their faith resides, which is at the level of the heart, right? So that a big part of this task clearly is, for sure, is developing a spirituality for peacemaking, right? It's for developing forms of liturgy and prayer and ritual that celebrate the work of justice. So yes, by all means, let me say, and I happen to notice on the program for the next day or two, I don't mean to plug one thing over others, but I did notice there is at least one presentation about liturgy and social justice. It's exactly what we need more of, not less of, in the church today. So thank you for your question.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Rodrigo Mardones. I'm a political scientist from the Catholic University of Chile. And as a political scientist, I am concerned with the state. So you mentioned that in the encyclica, the new approach to global governance is not the same than promoting a new global state. So we don't like the state, or Or is it that the encyclical takes more than a utopian vision, a kind of pragmatic, step-by-step approach to this issue of global governance?
No, I genuinely like the state, except when I get speeding tickets on the Massachusetts Turnpike. Then I'm not a fan of the state. But no, but by all means, no. I mean, yes, what you said secondly is really what we're talking about. I mean, I think it's very clear, you know, if you read the tradition of Catholic social and political thought, it's very clear. The church is very optimistic about the state. In fact, here in the United States, if most of those people who are Catholic and who were part of the Tea Party really knew Catholic political theory, they'd be stroking out half the time. It's a very positive view of the state, you know, and it stems from Aquinas, and Aquinas stealing from Aristotle, all right? In that the state is charged with protecting and promoting the common good. It's not the negative state that's just meant to restrain one another from infringing upon our natural rights. No, but the point was, and perhaps I didn't emphasize it enough, was what a kind of globalization from below is, rather than globalization from above, rather than starting with trying to create some, you know, global state and fashion a constitution for that. It's rather building from the ground up. It's building policy regimes. It's building grassroots networks that bring about, whether they are non-governmental or intergovernmental policy frameworks and networks that can govern the global space. So it's not an opposition to the state, but it's an attempt at trying to fashion a new way of thinking about how do we bring about regulation when there is no global state. Thank you. I think Kathy, Kathy, question?
Thank you for speaking so beautifully, really, about the biblical justice aimed at protecting widows and orphans and those who are most neglected. I'd like to hear more from you about the right to protect being perhaps understood as a humanitarian war that would be waged as an intervention to assist people who are oppressed, because I think we've seen several times the marketing of United States wars as a humanitarian war, and sometimes I think perhaps that could be considered an oxymoron.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, Kathy. I mean, you know, we always have to, in this stuff, we always have to recognize that, you know, our remarks in terms of like something like the just war tradition, it's been co-opted as often as it's, or maybe more often than that it's been used properly, you know, within policy circles. And that's always a risk. You know, it's always a risk that when you start trying to develop some norms, such as responsibility to protect, there are going to be people who are going to use that language that in fact are not really pursuing genuine humanitarian interventions, but they're about regime change or other sorts of agendas that they're really seeking. But I think when you look at some of the literature on responsibility to protect, there are attempts at least to try to put in place certain, you might say, constraints upon these things getting out of hand. Whether it is that, you know, such interventions always have to be multilateral rather than unilateral, whether it is that these things are best dealt with by, with approval, if not from the United Nations Security Council, but at least by regional organizations, the Organization of American States or the Organization of African States or whatever, that you try to see whether or not there is genuine multilateral concern rather than one nation deciding that we're going to come in as the, you know, the protector and lord of all, that sort of thing. But I would say that, you know, there's hardly a word in the English language that can't get co-opted and corrupted, you know. I mean, there are a hell of a lot of atrocities that have occurred in the world under the guise of love, but we don't stop using the word, nor do we disown the project of trying to create it, you know. I think the same thing is true here. There have been terrible atrocities done under the name of justice and the use of just force. I don't want to ignore that at all. But I don't think we should simply, because of that tragic fact, that we should rule out the possibility or rule out the idea that it's impossible to imagine or conceive of some use of force at times that might indeed be just. So I think that's what's really going on. You know, we're not talking about humanitarian interventions just because there are some modest or irregularities in a judicial system or something like this. But if we're talking about genuine genocide, you know, if we're talking about serious and persistent criminal activity by the actual state, all right, I think at that point that's where the responsibility to protect doctrine does begin to kick in, and where there are people who are at least willing to consider whether or not that's consonant with the Christian tradition. Jerry?
Jerry Powers of the Kroc Institute here at Notre Dame. Ken, when Pope Francis calls you in a couple weeks and asks for your advice on his new encyclical...
I gave you the name, by the way, Jerry. I suggested the name.
Thank you. And he asks you if what's the one area that I can address that would fill a gap in Catholic teaching on peace? What would you tell him?
I'm going to walk very slowly back to the microphone. That's a tough one, Jer. One thing, huh? One thing. Well, I'm going to strike out on this, I think, Jerry. But it seems to me that given the, and in some ways this goes back to Kathy's question, given the real difficulty in getting international organizations to function with some efficiency and measure of fairness, and the fact that you know, the UN Security Council gets paralyzed by the self-interest of the various members of the council at the time. Given those realities, that the international framework for getting that kind of multilateral cooperation is so difficult, what's Plan B? I guess for me that certainly looms large. After you get past, you know, the obvious, oh, why doesn't the United Nations do this, or, you know, why don't the consortium of countries really step in and do that? Once those things don't work, and you have a kind of failure of the international apparatus, what do or what can we ask of individual citizens or networks of citizens and disciples around the world to do if you really can't work through the normal apparatus of international relations and states? I think that's a problem. You know, we don't yet have the you know, the Plan B when Plan A isn't effective. You know, I don't know that's a great answer, but you know, it was a tough question, Jerry. You know? Yes.
My name is Christopher Damian. I'm a senior here at Notre Dame. So I think at the beginning of the Catholic social teaching tradition, there's a kind of a focus on a wide variety of issues in terms of like workers' rights, rights of citizens, and throughout that tradition, there was a kind of narrowing in emphasis, especially later on in the papacy of John Paul II, to focusing more within the Catholic social tradition on issues of like marriage and the family, which John the 23rd called like the basic unit or cell of society. And with Pope Benedict, there was kind of an emphasis in a lot of his addresses and writings on the kind of what he saw as like a crisis of Europe and of Western civilization and as a fall of civilization. So my question is, with a decline of marriage and family culture, how do we as Catholics talk about and promote our like Catholic social tradition and issues of rights and justice when there's been such a collapse of the basic unit of society.
Are you a friend of Jerry's coming out with... Jeez, I mean, I'm waiting for a softball up here, because all I'm getting is 100-mile-an-hour fastballs. You're absolutely right. The family is identified in Catholic political theory long before papal social encyclicals as a basic unit of society. So you're absolutely right. And I'm not sure. Probably if we sat down and talked later on tonight, we'd have to talk and see how total do we want to describe this collapse of that. I'm not sure. I'm despondent over the state of the family. Is it having problems? For sure, you know, and is the nuclear family going through some sort of crisis? For sure, you know, but more extended kinship families went through crises in certain societies, you know, and we came up with different models and different ways of coping with it. It seems to me, you know, change is the law is the one constant law, you know. So I'm not prepared to simply say, you know, the crisis is such that we can't recover and see some rejuvenation within the experience of family. But that said, you know, I think what you're finding I think what it's fair to say about Catholic social thought is this. The modern era, I don't want to go back early, but in the modern era, from the 19th century on, that's what Catholics call modern, folks, by the way, all right, 19th century. But from the modern era on, you're right, it starts off, and the primary focus was largely economic problems associated with the rise of industrialization and commerce. The focus on political concerns begins to kick in with Pius XII, to some extent with Leo XIII and some of his writings on democracy, but certainly with Pius XII during his Christmas addresses during World War II and the situations with the collapse of colonial empires and the like after World War II and the rise of the Soviet-US tensions and the like. And today, we are seeing a kind of, I would say not narrowing, but broadening of the tradition to begin to look at some of the concerns about marriage and family and the like. And in some ways, what that suggests to me is that, you know, Catholicism struggled with trying to come to terms with liberalism in all three guises. Liberal economics, namely laissez-faire free market economics, liberal politics, right? Civil liberties, democracies, limited constitutional governments, rights of religious toleration, free speech, and the like. That was a struggle for the church to come to terms with. In its own way, it has formulated, I think, a reasonable critique of the extremes of those two forms of liberalism, as well as been instructed by the wisdom of those two strands too. And so I think it's made its peace in some ways. I don't want to say that it's finalized, but it's somewhat made its peace with liberal politics, liberal economics, and we've established the ground rules for the conversation and the debate. Where I don't think we've yet come to terms with liberalism is questions of liberalism in culture. I think as we've wrestled with liberal politics and liberal economics, we have not wrestled with liberal culture. And I think in some ways, the whole, you know, controversies and problems that Catholicism now encounters and is dealing with, whether it's questions of same-sex marriage, whether it's questions of the rights of women within families, within societies, questions of reproductive rights, questions about diversity, you know, all those kinds of questions, it seems to me, we're going to have to go back, and it seems to me, and see if we can kickstart the conversations and see if we can have develop some sort of modus vivendi, if not complete agreement. No one's saying we ought to sell out our principles and we ought not expect that others are going to sell out theirs. but can we at least have a constructive conversation where we establish some of the clear ground rules for where are the points of accommodation, where are the points where there's going to be confrontation, how can we have the confrontation go on without it becoming open war. Those sorts of issues are still out there. So I guess what I would say is that maybe, one of the next phases of the evolution of Catholic social thought is going to have to be the church coming to terms with questions of liberalism as a cultural movement as well as a political and economic movement. I mean, we basically passed the decree on religious liberty and declared a victory, There's a lot more still that has to be explored in terms, it seems to me, of the whole question of liberalism and its impact on how we function within a culture that is pluralistic and diverse and liberal.
Can you ask both your questions together? You ask your question, you'll ask your question, and you can answer the last two questions then?
My comment, first of all, I have to thank the young man who asked the question about family. I actually paid him to ask that question. My name is Jacqueline Hazley, and I've worked as a peace education specialist locally, nationally, and internationally for about 40 years or more. And one of the things that I think is so important, and most of my work has focused on how do we help people in families develop the attitudes, the values, the skills to go out, the knowledge, to go out and live as peacemakers in the family, in the neighborhood communities, in the workplaces, and ultimately in the global society. And I think that that's a piece that is firmly rooted in the encyclical of Pacem and TERRIS in terms of education, but I don't think it's operationalized in terms of our conversations. I think when you said before that liturgy is really important, I think the other part is education, and that it's not just education about facts, it's education about the attitudes, the values, the skills, the how do we educate both about and for peace, and how do we do that in the family and in the classroom, in the workplaces, in our adult education gatherings. So I really hope that as this conference proceeds, that aspect will be looked at more intentionally. Where is that we can bring in the questions of how do we educate the children in our homes as mothers and as fathers and as other caregivers, and then how do we take that and help us all go out and create that culture of peace in a much broader society. I think that's something we can all do. I think it's something we all probably believe in, but we just don't do it in our homes with our children, and we don't find a way to spread that word that we can all do it. So that's my passion, that's my plea, and I just urge everybody here to think more carefully about how we do that within and beyond the family.
Hi, my name's Chris Whalen. I'm a senior in one of Mr. Power's classes.
Another plant.
I struggle with all those questions too, so thanks for showing me I'm in good company, first of all. Oh, I noticed that you used a lot of religious vocabulary and themes in your presentation. And in light of the universality of the call to peace found in the encyclical, would you do anything differently if you're presenting to a more secular audience?
Now, coming from Boston College, we don't presume Notre Dame is a religious... Did I say something? Did I say something? No. All in fun, believe me. I have great respect for this university, great respect. Until I get out of here, I have great respect for this university. No, I mean, that's a terrific question. There's I don't want to stand too far away from melting ice cream. There's a social right at 9 o'clock, but there's two ways I guess you could answer this thing, and I'll tell you my preference is the second way. The first way, of course, is to sort of take the approach that you've got to kind of sanitize your language of all kind of religious rhetoric when you're speaking in public. That the public space has to be a sort of secular space that is sort of denuded of religious traditions and religious affiliations. And there certainly is a legitimate argument for that. And I think certainly that would be true in certain kinds of public space. I wouldn't, I don't think any of us would want judges to be rendering verdicts not on the basis of, democratically passed legislation and laws, but on the basis of some judge's religious convictions. There are times when, and I think probably all of us are a little tired of various politicians professing how often they go to church. So there are times when that rhetoric is both unappealing, and at other times it would be downright, I think, or dangerous for American public life to have that. But the second way of thinking about this is that not all aspects of public life need to be denuded of religious rhetoric and religious values. And that is to say that presentations that try to explain to people, not that you have to agree with my entire comprehensive worldview, right? But that all I'm trying to do is explain to you what is my worldview and where my convictions come from. You may find other reasons and other motivations to have convictions that overlap with mine. And that's wonderful. That's how you build consensus, right? But for a deeper level of discussion at the level of citizens or public individuals coming to know one another in public life, to be able to appreciate how someone's Islamic heritage or someone's Baptist heritage or someone's agnosticism shapes and influences the way they come at something, I think that kind of deeper dialogue we probably could use more of rather than less of in society. The image I like goes back to that of a man named, that may be a name familiar to some of you or many of you, David Tracy, a wonderful theologian, now retired, used to teach for many years at the University of Chicago. Tracy uses the image of what he calls a religious classic. And what he means by this is similar to the way we use a term like a classic of literature, right? You and I can go and see, a production of Hamlet now, and we can go back 5 years from now or 10 years from now and see a production of Hamlet, and we get something entirely different from it, right? Or if not different, we see something we didn't see before. We get a different insight into something. That what a classic does is, a classic has a surplus of knowledge. You can keep going back to classics, and you keep mining them for more and more insights. So you can go and you can look at a great work of art, and you go to visit the museum once. You can go back a second time. You can go back a third time and look at a picture, and it gives you something more, right? Because it's not simply one meaning, right? There are multiple meanings in a classic, and you can keep going back and being enriched by those meanings. And they continue to transform us and speak to us at multiple levels, right? For me, I think there are, and I'm sure for all of us, right? We all have certain religious classics, right? There are things we can go back to examine, to study, to reflect on, to pray over, and we keep getting more insight. We get a richer view of things. So I just don't read the Good Samaritan once, and then from there on say, oh yeah, I read Luke that time, flip the page. You keep going back, right? You keep hearing it again, right? You just don't, say the Our Father once and say, oh yeah, I learned that prayer. There are certain things you do again and again, and it's precisely by revisiting them, re-engaging with them, you get deeper and deeper insight. To tell a society that it can't use religious classics, that it can't bring into its discourse the wisdom of whether it be the Quran or it be the New Testament or it be the Old Testament, or any religious text, to tell people that, we ought not to be thinking about the meaning of life by using, certain religious poetry or certain religious art, that, there's nothing more to be learned from the Pietà, or there's nothing more we can gather from visiting a Gothic cathedral. This, it seems to me, is really to shut down the possibilities of a richer, deeper discourse in American society. It's not that I'm speaking to convert you, I'm speaking to share with you. And I think if we understand that not every use of religious language is always about proselytizing, right? But we're using religious language in order that I can let you know what is the deepest, most intensely felt passions that I have. That, it seems to me, becomes a way to really develop a style of democratic discourse that gets us beyond this very thin language of self-interest, which ultimately can't carry a community, right? You've got to talk to one another about what is it that empowers me? What is it about that I have passion? Why is it that I get up in the morning and I care, right? Unless we can talk about those sorts of things to one another, it seems to me we greatly, you might say, shrivel the human spirit in a democracy. And we're going to wind up being very one-dimensional citizens. So for me, the real task is, how do I talk about my faith in a way that's accessible to others? Not accessible in the sense of, have I persuaded you or have I convinced you, but in the sense of, do you understand me now? And can I be a sensitive enough listener that you can talk to me out of your tradition and I can say, I get it. I see where you're coming from. I know why that hurts so much, or I know why you're so angry about that problem, or I know why you care and why you're giving so much of your energy and resources to that concern. To have that kind of conversation in public, it seems to me, is the way we become the sort of democracy that I think we want to be.